Hey there. Tonight we're curling up with one of the most brutal bedtime stories in human history, though. Don't worry, I'll be gentle. You're about to step into a world where love meant loyalty, but loyalty meant blood. Where the words "till death do us part" weren't poetic, they were policy. And if you're still here, still listening, it probably means you're one of those curious minds who can find calm even in the strangest corners of history. So only if you'd like to feel free to tap subscribe and drift with me through a darker kind of romance, the kind your history teacher definitely left out. Tonight's story, it begins with a wedding. But not just any wedding. A Viking wedding night. One where the candlelight flickers not over cake and dancing, but over weapons fire pits and something that smells suspiciously like iron and ash. Don't worry, you'll get used to it. Everyone else did. Now, in case you've ever found yourself watching a modern wedding and thinking, gosh, this is exhausting, just wait. Because by the time you finish hearing what an actual Viking bride went through, you might never complain about centerpieces or seating charts again. And by the end of this journey, we'll reflect gently on how many of today's romantic rituals carry faint echoes of things far more terrifying than mismatched bridesmaid dresses. So pull the blankets close, breathe slow, and prepare yourself for a wedding night. You definitely wouldn't survive. You don't remember how you got here, not exactly. You were told to come early, but early turned out to mean before sunrise. The village looks almost peaceful in this light thatched rooftops glistening with frost smoke curling from longhouse chimneys. But under that stillness is something taut, something ritualistic. Because tonight isn't a party. It's a performance of power, and you're not just attending it. You are it. They've dressed you in layers, wool, fur, leather, but you still feel cold. Not from the wind, but from the way everyone looks at you. Not kindly, not cruelly, just watching, judging, waiting to see if you'll flinch. Because in a Viking wedding, the bride doesn't walk down the aisle. She walks into a trial. You're not sure which part is worse, the chants outside or the silence inside. The women braid your hair with runes. Someone smudges ash on your face, not makeup, just ash. There's a tiny iron dagger placed in your palm. It's ceremonial, they say. But you know better. The ceremony is about pain. See, Viking wedding nights weren't private affairs. In some regions, they happened before witnesses, not necessarily to be watched in full, but to be heard, confirmed, verified. Marriage was a public contract, sealed not with a kiss, but with dominance. A successful union required proof that the groom had won the bride, not just her affection, but her submission. If he didn't demonstrate that, well, the community could declare the ceremony incomplete. They could demand a redo, with more witnesses, with more force. Now, before you panic, yes, it's horrifying. But also, yes, it was normalized, expected, just another part of the social machinery. In Viking culture, marriage was not a matter of the heart. It was a geopolitical alliance. It was a transfer of property, land, livestock, and wombs. And the wedding night. That was the battlefield where the deal was sealed. Of course, not every ceremony was equally harsh. There were variations by region, by rank, by century. Some couples may have found genuine tenderness between the lines. But the structure, the system, the symbolism, always about power. The groom didn't just take a wife. He claimed her, proved it. And everyone else watched, if not with eyes, then with ears, counting the screams. You remember the old women warning you to bite your tongue. Literally. If you scream, they'll think he's doing it right. If you cry, they'll cheer. If you resist, you might be blamed. And if you survive quietly, then maybe you'll be praised for loyalty, for obedience, for grace under pressure. Historians still argue whether these acts were uniformly expected across all Norse regions, or whether they were dramatized in later sagas to glorify masculine brutality. What's clear, however, is that the Viking marriage night wasn't about intimacy. It was about ritual control. The line between ceremony and punishment was paper thin, And that thin line, you're walking it now. Your groom arrives not in silks or with flowers, but wearing his battle cloak. He's still blood-stained from earlier some duel he fought to honor you. You weren't told who the other man was, just that your new husband won, that his sword spoke for your dowry, that he earned you. Now, here's a tidbit that might twist your stomach in some Viking communities. If the bride showed too much resistance, she wasn't considered a proper match, and the ceremony had to be redone, not just out of tradition, but as a form of humiliation correction. And if the groom failed to dominate convincingly, he too could be mocked, shamed, or even replaced, because a weak man couldn't run a household, and a rebellious woman couldn't raise obedient children. You might be wondering, how did this become normal? How could people go along with this? The answer is surprisingly quiet repetition. Generations raised on this pattern didn't see it as monstrous. They saw it as meaningful, as spiritual, as necessary for social survival. If anything, they pitied the ones who didn't have such rituals, those poor souls whose marriages weren't proven. And yet, through all of this, you notice something strange. The younger girls aren't cheering. They're watching you with a kind of breathless stillness, as if memorizing what happens next, because someday it'll be them. And they need to know how loud is too loud, how still is still enough, how much resistance becomes risk. In that moment, you realize the Viking wedding night isn't just a ceremony. It's a lesson plan, a training ground for women, a proving ground for men. And somewhere inside you, beneath the fear, beneath the pain, something steadies. Not because you accept it, but because you understand what it means to break the pattern even if you can't stop it yet. Some stories from the sagas even describe grooms leaving marks, physical ones, as evidence that the marriage was sealed. A bite, a bruise, a burn. It sounds barbaric. But then again, so does branding cattle. And in that system, the difference between bride and livestock was frankly administrative. But here's the curious part. Not all Viking women were passive. Some clans had shield maidens, warrior brides who could and did fight back. In rare instances, sagas tell of brides challenging their grooms to ritual combat. If she won, he had to forfeit certain marital privileges, or in some cases the entire union. These women were rare, yes, but not mythical. They were remembered, and in that maybe is a quiet kind of hope. That even in a world so drenched in hierarchy and harm, resistance existed, however small, however soft, even whispered. As the wedding fire burns low and your breath fogs the air, you begin to understand what it meant to survive a Viking wedding night. It wasn't just physical survival. It was emotional endurance, psychological dissociation, knowing when to stay still and when to fight silently. It was resilience disguised as surrender. You don't know what tomorrow brings. Maybe more rituals, maybe new roles, maybe just silence. But tonight you survived, and in this world that's more than enough. And slowly, gently, we leave the firelight behind. You don't sleep that night. Not really. Even after the fire dies down and the whispers fade, your mind stays awake, rehearsing everything that just happened. Not the sounds, not the movements, just the feeling of being watched, measured, claimed. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet truth settles in this was just the beginning. Because in Viking culture, marriage wasn't a declaration of love. It was a qualification. And before you ever became a wife, someone had to prove they were worthy of marrying you. Or rather, someone had to prove they were worthy of possessing you. That proof came in 3 stages, what historians now call the 3 bloods. It sounds poetic, almost mythic, doesn't it? Like something from an epic saga whispered beside a hearth. But make no mistake, this was a checklist. And the blood real. The first requirement was simple: kill a man. Not in theory, not in sport, in battle, with witnesses, This wasn't just about courage, it was about establishing that your groom could destroy something precious to someone else. It was a way of showing he had what it took to protect, conquer, and lead. In other words, he had to cause pain to demonstrate potential. You remember when they told you that he fought for you. What they didn't tell you was that the man he killed had no choice. That he might have been sick or old or outnumbered. Because the goal wasn't honor, it was victory. A man who chose a weak opponent was seen as efficient, not cowardly. A groom who returned soaked in blood no matter how it was earned was praised. And the blood he spilled, it became part of your dowry. The second trial was more intimate. A test of physical and spiritual endurance, the trial by ordeal. This varied depending on region and generation, but one of the most infamous versions involved placing your hand in boiling water or walking across burning iron. If your wounds healed cleanly, you were declared favored by the gods. If they didn't, you were cursed. Roughly 40% of participants died from the ordeal. Many others lived with infections, amputations, or lifelong disfigurement. And yet it wasn't considered cruel, it was considered clarifying. This was how the gods revealed who was worthy of union. And if your groom was one of the lucky ones who passed, he bore those scars like a certificate, a tattoo written by fire. The third and final test was the most sacred, the offering. A human sacrifice made not in rage or revenge, but in reverence. This wasn't wartime slaughter. It was ceremonial. Often the victim was chosen for their symbolic value. Someone from a rival clan. Someone considered dishonored, or even in some cases, a willing volunteer who saw their death as a sacred act. The groom had to perform the act himself. He could not delegate it. This wasn't about logistics. It was about demonstration. The blood had to be on his hands. Only then would the gods and the community see him as ready to take a bride. Historians still argue whether these 3 bloods were required for every marriage or only for certain ranks, chieftains, warriors, or high-born heirs. But archaeological records, runestone inscriptions, and saga literature all point to a widespread reverence for these trials. They weren't random acts of violence, they were rituals. And rituals once normalized are hard to question. You're beginning to see the shape of it now, aren't you? This wasn't just about love. It wasn't even about partnership. It was about proving that the man entering your life had already conquered death and was prepared to use it if needed to secure your future, or his. There's a strange tidbit buried in the margins of one 13th century Icelandic saga. In some communities, if a man failed any of the 3 blood trials, he could substitute an animal sacrifice, but only if the bride's family agreed. The catch. The animal had to be from the bride's own livestock, and the groom had to kill it in front of her. It was a brutal compromise, but it offered a rare glimpse into negotiation, into consent, however distorted. You think back to the men you saw preparing for your wedding, the quiet way they sharpened their blades, the absence of laughter. They weren't planning a party. They were preparing a campaign, and the woman at the center of it, you, was both the goal and the symbol, the reward and the witness. Now that you understand the 3 bloods, everything makes more sense. The blood on your husband's sleeves, the silence at the feast, the wary looks from women who've seen this before. This wasn't about cruelty for its own sake. It was about order, about continuity, about reminding everyone watching that marriage in this world wasn't soft or sacred. It was severe. It had to be, because life was severe. You imagine what it must have been like for a young Viking boy watching his older brother return from battle with blood on his hands, knowing that meant a wedding was coming. That love wasn't something you found. It was something you fought for, literally. And if you couldn't kill, couldn't bleed, couldn't suffer, you weren't a man. You weren't ready. You weren't worthy. There's a heartbreaking logic to it in a way. In a world where death was common, where survival was never guaranteed, Perhaps the idea was to build marriages on the same foundations as war loyalty, sacrifice domination. If love could endure the same pain as combat, maybe it would last longer. Maybe it would be unbreakable. Of course we know better now. Or we think we do. But the remnants of these beliefs are still buried deep in the cultural soil. Every modern cliché about fighting for love, every story about a man who proves himself through pain, every romantic film where suffering is equated with passion, those all carry echoes of the three bloods. They may have lost their swords and sacrifices, but the structure remains. You pause for a moment, imagining what it would look like if today's grooms were asked to complete these trials. Most would laugh. Some might balk, but a few you suspect might still be eager. Still believe that love must be earned through suffering, that violence makes passion more real. It's a dangerous idea, but an old one. And old ideas don't die easily. So when you see the scars on your husband's arms, when he speaks of the man he killed, the fire he walked through, the offering he made, you listen. Not because you agree, but because you know that in this world these trials weren't just rituals. They were language. And to survive here, you must understand the language of blood. You step outside for a moment just to breathe. The air is sharp and cold. Somewhere in the distance a raven calls. And beneath the frosted sky you wonder not just what he endured to marry you, but what you'll be asked to endure to stay. The snow is thicker now, and your boots sink deeper with every step. Around you, the village is moving slowly, deliberately, like a living thing preparing for something sacred. There's no music, no laughter, no flower petals in the air, just the scraping of wood, the clinking of metal, and the occasional grunt as men carry lumberstone and ropes toward a wide central space near the gathering hall. You pause at the edge of it, all watching. They're not building a stage. They're building a prison. You'd thought maybe that the hardest part was over, that once the wedding night was done, once the vows had been shouted, and the union confirmed, the rest might settle into quietness. But that's not how Viking weddings worked. Because now comes the part that matters most to everyone else, the preparation of the celebration. And make no mistake, this celebration is not a party. It's an operation. In Norse tradition, weddings weren't just personal. They were communal, logistical, and deeply political. They were often coordinated months in advance, involving dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. And unlike modern weddings, where the stress revolves around seating charts and venue lighting, Viking wedding prep was more akin to a war council. Weapons had to be chosen, guards assigned ritual spaces, marked out with sacred symbols. If the bride or groom came from prominent families or warrior clans, temporary prisons were built to hold captives taken during ceremonial raids or symbolic challenges. Yes, actual raids, staged or real, were sometimes included in the lead-up to major weddings to demonstrate the groom's strength and the clan's superiority. The scale of these preparations was staggering. According to archaeological evidence from Viking-age settlements in Iceland and parts of Sweden, entire communities could spend weeks or even months preparing for a wedding. Excavations at the Borg site in northern Norway revealed massive hearths, butchered animal remains, and ritualized burial pits, all dated to a single event, likely a wedding. These events consumed enormous resources: livestock, weapons, sacred totems, alcohol labor. In today's money, estimates suggest that a Viking chieftain's wedding could cost the equivalent of $150,000, $200,000, but not for dresses or photographers. That money went toward outfitting warriors, feeding hundreds, and staging rituals that involve fireblood and symbolic torture. And here's the grim statistic that stops you cold. According to multiple reconstructions of saga-era events, it's estimated that up to 31% of those involved in Viking wedding preparations died before the ceremony even began. Not always from violence, some died during rituals, some from infections, others in pre-ceremony duels. But the message was clear. This wasn't a cake tasting. It was a trial of worthiness for everyone involved. You watch as a wooden cage is hoisted upright. It sways gently in the wind. A man hammers iron spikes into the posts, not for decoration, for deterrence. And suddenly you understand why everyone's so quiet, why no one's laughing or dancing yet. Because here the wedding is the test. The celebration comes only if everyone survives, and even then only if the gods approve. There's a tidbit in the 14th century Icelandic manuscript Ljósvetninga Saga that describes a wedding in which the bride's brother refused to participate in a ritual duel. The community interpreted this as an omen. The groom's family lost face, and the wedding was canceled not because the couple didn't love each other, but because the ritual structure had collapsed. The brother was later exiled, and the bride sent to a distant relative for re-education in obedience. That wasn't an outlier. That was the system working as intended. You realize now that your own wedding wasn't just about you and your groom. It was about everyone around you. Every family member, every clansman, every rival warrior, each with a stake in whether this union succeeded. If anything went wrong, they'd feel the shame. If everything went right, they'd share the glory. You try to picture the wedding preparations you'd always imagined: a garland of flowers, a cozy hearth, friends gossiping while setting tables. But here, tables are built with weapons hanging beneath them. The garlands are made of bones and carved runes. And the gossip? It's about who will be the entertainment, willing or not. Some of the older women move past you, carrying heavy sacks filled with ceremonial items: animal skulls, incense, dried herbs, strips of cloth dyed in bloodroot. These are for warding, for protection, for power. One of them catches your eye. She doesn't smile, just nods slightly as if to say, "This is how it has always been." Historians still debate how widespread these extreme practices were. Some believe they were limited to elite families, chieftains and jarls trying to impress allies and intimidate enemies. Others argue that even smaller villages incorporated symbolic versions of these rituals, adapting them based on resources and local gods. But the through line remains: Viking weddings were about community validation, not private affection. And that validation came through spectacle sacrifice and shared participation in ritual stress. There's a part of you that wants to run, to walk into the woods and never come back. But another part, deeper, quieter, knows that surviving this isn't just about physical safety. It's about understanding the pattern, seeing it clearly, and making different choices when and where you can. Even if they're small. You help carry a log to the fire pit. No one thanks you. That's not what this is about. It's about being useful, visible, part of the machinery. Because invisibility here is dangerous. It invites suspicion. A strange phrase drifts into your mind, something you heard long ago. To be chosen is not always a blessing. You understand it now. Being the bride means being the centerpiece. And being the centerpiece means you must not crack. Not under pressure. Not under scrutiny. Not under the weight of expectations sharpened like spears. The fire is lit at sunset. It's massive, 10 feet across, fed by logs soaked in animal fat. As the smoke rises, warriors chant. Children are told to watch to remember. This is how loyalty looks, they say. This is how strength smells. This is what it means to be one of us. You stand quietly, hands at your sides. Heart steady, but not calm. Because calm is not part of this culture. Readiness is. As sparks drift into the night sky, you wonder how many people will make it through to tomorrow's feast. How many will falter? How many will be remembered? And you begin to see it, marriage, not as a joining, but as a sorting. A line drawn in ash and fire. Those who endure and those who don't. The fire doesn't die until morning. It roars through the night like a second sun fed by logs, bones, oil, and obligation. You barely sleep just long enough to dream of hands tying your wrists with ceremonial cords, and voices chanting words you don't understand. When you wake, the smell of ash clings to your skin, and the dawn mist curls low around the longhouses, like something trying to hide. But there is no hiding. Not today. Because today someone is being taken, and that someone is you. You've heard the stories. Everyone has. Even as children, Viking girls are told tales of how love begins, not with a song or a poem, but with a scream or a door kicked in. In many parts of Scandinavia, courtship was less an exchange of sweet words, and more a carefully timed act of force. Raiding a rival clan and carrying off a bride wasn't just acceptable, it was sometimes expected. In fact, the term bride price comes directly from this tradition, a symbolic sum paid to compensate for the loss, not of affection, but of a resource. Historians have recorded countless examples of Viking marriages beginning in violence. But not the chaos of battlefield romance. More often it was the quiet, coordinated kind. A small group of warriors led by the suitor would arrive under the cover of night surround the homestead and deliver their message. Sometimes with a gift, sometimes with a warning. If the family agreed to the union, the bride was taken as a sign of goodwill. If not, something else was taken: livestock, weapons, or blood. You remember now the night he came to your family's farm. You were told to stay in your room, to pray, not to ask questions. And when the morning came, you were promised this was the honorable path, the safer path, because the other option was worse. Here's a detail most stories leave out in some Viking communities. If a man's proposal was refused, he was socially entitled to retaliate within limits. Burning part of the family's property, slaughtering animals, or publicly shaming the patriarch could all be considered valid responses to rejection. And in a disturbing twist, the bride's eventual agreement, especially if made to end the violence, was celebrated as proof of her loyalty and strength. She didn't just marry him, she tamed him. You see it even in the old sagas. One tells of a man who killed 3 of his beloved suitors to win her affection. When she finally agreed to marry him, mostly to end the bloodshed, it was described as a triumph of passion, a story of love conquering all, including her own family. Historians still debate how universal these customs were. Some argue that bride abduction was mostly mythologized, after the fact a literary exaggeration to frame arranged marriages as romantic. Others suggest it was far more common, especially among families without the power to enforce alliances peacefully. But there is little debate about how it was remembered as tradition, as drama, as a thing to be passed down, and so it was. Now you stand at the center of the village, flanked by women who don't speak. They dress you slowly, carefully, not in white or silk, but in dark wool dyed red with crushed berries and something more metallic. It's not meant to be beautiful. It's meant to signal that you are no longer your father's daughter. You are a gift, a vessel, a pledge made flesh. There's a tidbit buried in one saga, easy to miss, but unforgettable once seen. A bride whose groom had slaughtered her brothers to force the union was praised in song for her calm acceptance. The poem describes her as a jewel in the ashes, a woman who turned grief into grace. She is remembered not as a victim, but as an ideal. Because suffering without protest was considered a form of virtue, you feel the crowd gathering. Not close Vikings respected personal space even in ceremony, but close enough to see, to bear witness. This is not just a rite for you. It's a performance for them. Proof that alliances have been honored, debts paid, roles confirmed. Your husband arrives dressed in furs and iron. He's cleaned himself since the ordeal, but the smell of smoke still lingers around him, like something he's earned. He nods to you. You do not speak. The elder steps forward. She holds a carved staff decorated with symbols of Freya, the goddess of fertility, love, and war. Fitting, really, because Viking marriage always involved all 3. She begins the chant, The crowd hums in response, and your wrists are tied not tightly, not cruelly, but visibly. The cords are red, not dyed, red. This is the moment, the taking. In this culture, the word bride literally comes from a root meaning to cook or to make ready. Not for romance, for use. You are now the embodiment of alliance, a bridge between households. And like all bridges, you must bear weight. As the cords tighten, you feel neither pain nor panic, just gravity. You're not collapsing, you're anchoring. And everyone is watching to make sure you don't break. There's a strange softness to it all beneath the iron and blood. The idea that in accepting this, you become stronger. That by not fighting, you claim a kind of silent power. It's a dangerous story, but an old one. And in old stories, survival is rarely loud. The procession begins. You are led past the cages, the weapons, the burning altar. Children watch their eyes wide, trying to understand what it means to be chosen. Some will envy you. Others will pity you. None will forget you. And you walk steadily. Not because you want to, not because you agree, but because you understand that in this world silence is a shield. Stillness is a strategy. But somewhere in the back of your mind, you also understand this: the stories they tell about you will not be true. They will say you were willing, that you smiled, that you were honored. And maybe one day someone will hear those stories and wonder, just wonder. And maybe that will be enough. Because change doesn't always begin with rebellion. Sometimes it begins with a single woman, walking through fire not to burn, but to endure. The cords come off after the procession, but the mark remains. Not a bruise, not a cut, just an awareness like your skin remembers where it was bound. You sit on a wooden bench near the ceremonial hearth, watching the embers crackle in silence, and the elder woman beside you doesn't speak. She just hums a low melody, almost tuneless, barely louder than the fire. You don't ask what it means. You already know. It's not a song for celebration. It's a song for containment. Tonight is the unity ritual. Not a kiss, not a dance. Something older, wilder, binding not in metaphor but in symbol and substance. A Viking wedding, after all, wasn't truly complete until blood had been shared. Not shared. The union needed to be witnessed by the gods, yes, but more than that, it needed to be tasted. You've seen the bowls being prepared earlier in the day, ornate carved from horn, rimmed with polished bronze. Inside a mixture of fermented honey herbs ash and something darker, a few drops of pig's blood. And if your groom is especially devoted, his own blood too. The couple drinks from the same bowl, one after the other, sealing the marriage in what the sagas called the mingling of strength. This was no symbolic toast. This was sacrifice reduced to a recipe. Historians have verified the use of blood-infused ceremonial drinks in Norse wedding and fertility rituals. While not all involved human blood, it was not uncommon for warrior families, particularly those claiming descent from Odin, to include their own in small amounts, usually via shallow cuts made during the ceremony. The intent wasn't to shock, but to sanctify. In a worldview shaped by death and rebirth, blood was life and life was offering. You're handed the bowl by the elder, your fingers cold against its warmth. It smells sweet and sour metallic, and earthy like wine left too long in a wooden cask. You don't hesitate. You sip. Not deeply, just enough. Enough to say, I see this. I carry this. Then you pass it to him. He drinks deeper. Everyone watches. No one claps. It's hard to explain to someone from your time just how differently unity was perceived in the Viking world. It wasn't about compatibility or romance or shared values. It was about survival. Would you bleed for each other? Would you break bread? Would you break bone? These were the questions a community asked when determining if two people belonged together. Not how well they laughed, not how often they touched, but how they endured, especially under fire. There's a peculiar tidbit mentioned in the 12th century Hervarar saga about a couple who sealed their unity not with drink, but with a shared wound. Each made a shallow cut on the palm and pressed them together until the blood mingled. The ceremony was overseen by a local seeress, who then used the mingled blood to paint protective runes on the doorway of their new home. It wasn't superstition. It was contract. And contracts in Viking culture weren't made in ink. They were carved. You sit beside your husband now, hands still warm from the bowl, and the elder begins the next phase. She lights a long, low candle, carved with intertwined symbols of the gods, Freyr and Freya, fertility and prosperity, male and female seed and soil. You each take the wick and light it together, then press it into a shallow dish of oil and wax. It sputters once, then holds. And there it is, the modern unity candle. Stripped of violence, repackaged as sweetness, but its bones are here flickering between your fingers. Historians still argue over how much of these rituals were consistent across Viking settlements. The culture was never monolithic. Norway, Iceland, Denmark, and Sweden all practiced their own variants, often influenced by local beliefs and evolving traditions. But the use of bodily symbols, blood, breath, flame, flesh remained a common thread. The wedding wasn't just a social event. It was a spell, one that required ingredients as much as intention. Now comes the feast. But unlike modern receptions where joy spills easily and laughter echoes through dance floors, this feast is tense, ceremonial, heavy with meaning. Guests are seated in carefully arranged tiers, elders closest to the fire warriors near the exits. Women and children near the back, watchful. Food is passed, mostly meats and mead, nothing too fresh. Every motion has purpose. Every toast has weight. And the entertainment, not music, not speeches, but reenactments, symbolic performances of battles, of raids, of sacrifices. Some are mimed, others less so. A group of boys duel with wooden swords while the men place quiet bets. One falls hard and cries out. No one moves to help him. His mother watches silently. He does not cry again. You realize what this is now. The feast is not for fun. It's for fortification. The rituals have bound you and your groom, but the feast binds the tribe. This is their unity, their collective drink, their shared witness. And beneath the laughter and low talk, there is something else. A lesson. A whisper. This is what marriage means. It is sacred because it costs. It is holy because it hurts. There's a moment during the meal when your husband cuts a slice of meat from his plate and places it on yours. Not romantic. Ritual. A gesture of dominance. Of provision. You are reminded that in some parts of Viking Scandinavia, it was customary for the groom to offer the bride the first bite of cooked meat, symbolizing her dependence on him for survival. If she refused it, the marriage was considered shaky. If she accepted, she affirmed the hierarchy. You eat the meat. And for a flicker of time, you wonder what it would be like to have a marriage that didn't need blood to bind it. One that relied on words, on smiles, on shared glances across firelight. You think about the women who came before you, who bled, who burned, who bent, and you wonder how many of them dreamed the same thing. But there's no time for dreaming. The elder rises. The fire is stoked again. A voice calls out the next ritual. It's not over yet. Because unity here isn't a moment. It's a process, a forging, a binding, and you're not done being shaped. The fire rises again higher this time, fed with pine branches and marrow-soaked logs. It throws shadows across the faces of the gathered villagers' shadows that stretch long, then ripple as the flames crackle and twist. You sit beside your new husband, eyes forward, body still. But the air has changed. The tension that once felt hushed and ceremonial now hums with anticipation. Something is about to begin. Not a dance, not a speech. Something older, rougher. This, as they say, is the entertainment. You hear the sound before you see anything, a deep thud like something heavy hitting packed earth. Then another, then laughter, but not the soft, joyful kind. The kind of laughter that circles someone weaker, that dares them to run. And then you see it, the first game of the evening. A man stripped to the waist is led into the center of the gathering space. His hands are tied loosely. His face is painted with runes. His eyes, dull and resigned, look past the crowd. A young woman, barely more than a girl, stands on the opposite side holding a wooden staff. She hesitates. The crowd begins to chant, slowly, rhythmically, not cruelly, but insistently. She swings, lightly at first, then again, and again. Each strike earns a louder cheer, until she hits hard enough to make him stumble. You don't realize you're holding your breath until your husband's hand shifts slightly beside yours. He doesn't grip you, just rests his fingers nearby, reminding you this is normal. This is tradition. You are not meant to interfere. It's difficult to imagine now, but in many Viking communities, wedding feasts included public games designed to dramatize dominance, fertility, or symbolic punishment. These weren't always violent. Some were more like plays or parodies, but others were real structured contests of pain and endurance. Guests would form teams, sometimes based on their relationship to the bride or groom, and compete to see who could create the most memorable performance. And memorable in this context often meant brutal. According to several medieval sagas, such as Gisla Saga and Völsunga Saga, guests sometimes reenacted legendary battles using real weapons. Though dulled or modified, injuries were not uncommon. In fact, certain grooms were expected to display their strength by participating in stage fights where the goal was not victory but theatricality. A well-placed blow that drew blood could be cheered louder than a win, because this wasn't sport. It was spectacle. Historians still argue whether these rituals were literal or exaggerated in literary retellings. Some point to archaeological evidence of feast halls bearing signs of combat damage and bloodstaining near hearths and central pits, while others believe many of these events were more symbolic or ritualized than truly harmful. But even the symbolic violence, when wrapped in ritual and expectation, becomes deeply formative, especially for the children watching. You glance across the fire and see them boys, barely old enough to lift a spear, mimicking what they see with sticks and shouts. Girls whispering behind hands, eyes wide, half frightened, half fascinated. They're learning, not just what marriage looks like, but what love is supposed to cost. There's a story passed down in the northern Fjordlands about a bride who laughed too loudly during the feast. Her laughter, according to the saga, was seen as disrespectful to the groom's family, who had arranged a particularly elaborate torture game involving a live pig and a mock duel. As punishment, she was made to participate in the next round of entertainment, this time as a target. The story is told not as a tragedy, but as a lesson in humility. You feel your pulse rise. The next round begins. This time, it's men wrestling near the fire pit. Their shirts are off their skin, already smeared with soot and sweat. The winner receives a ceremonial horn of mead. The loser is tied to a post and pelted with stale bread and bones by the watching crowd. Everyone laughs. Your groom laughs. You don't. Here's a tidbit that might twist your stomach in some high-status weddings, especially those involving multiple clans or regions. The couple themselves were expected to host or invent a unique game, something never seen before, to impress the elders. One recorded example involves a mock execution, where the groom saves a captured guest at the last minute, proving mercy and power in a single gesture. The guest, of course, had agreed to the role beforehand, but not always. Not everyone was asked. You begin to understand why so much effort went into the feast, why it lasted days, sometimes weeks. It wasn't just celebration, it was conditioning. Every laugh, every cheer, every shared glance across the fire was a way of reinforcing the rules. The hierarchy, The idea that love and pain must always walk together. There's a slow moment now, a pause between games. Plates are passed. Meat is carved. The elder stands again this time to recite an old verse, something about bonds and blood gods and oaths. Her voice is steady, but her eyes scan the crowd like a hawk, watching, measuring, ensuring the mood stays within bounds. Too much chaos and the gods may turn away. Too little energy and the union might be seen as weak. Historians believe these feasts served more than just social cohesion. They were also used to establish or reinforce power structures within the clan. Those who participated enthusiastically in violent entertainment were often rewarded with higher status. Those who hesitated or objected were quietly pushed to the margins. In this way, the feast became a tool of soft control, a theater of complicity. You look around and see it now. The men shouting the loudest were the ones already close to the groom. The women who look away sit slightly farther from the fire, a subtle geography of belonging. And you're somewhere in the middle, not cheering, not objecting, just enduring, like so many before you. Your husband leans in and says something you don't catch. You nod anyway. It doesn't matter. Words are secondary here. What matters is that you're still seated, still present, still silent. The final game of the night begins as the fire dips low, now more ember than flame. A circle is drawn in the dirt. 2 men step into it. Only one leaves. It's staged, you're told. They won't go too far. But when one of them stumbles and blood hits the ground, no one moves to help. You remember the elder's voice earlier in the day. This is how strength is shared. And for the first time, you wonder if anyone ever walked away. If any bride in the long history of these rituals ever said no, ever ran, ever vanished into the woods. And if she did what they said about her afterward, probably nothing kind. Because in a world where survival depends on cooperation, refusal is rebellion, and rebellion must be erased, but maybe just maybe remembered too. By the time dawn breaks again, the air feels different. Not lighter, just quieter. As if the land itself is catching its breath after days of heat, blood, and ritual. You move carefully, limbs aching in places you hadn't noticed before, throat dry from the smoke, but not yet hoarse from speaking because you haven't spoken much at all. That's the way it's supposed to be for you. A Viking bride should be seen, recognized, remembered, but not necessarily heard. And today you're not the only one being tested. In most modern weddings, the spotlight shifts after the ceremony. Attention drifts to toasts, food, small talk. But in Viking culture, the rituals continued. And now the focus narrows again, not on ceremony, not on entertainment, but on ownership. This morning is for the symbolic transfer of power. The ritual that confirms that you, the bride, no longer belong to your birth family. You belong to the clan that received you, and more specifically to the man who claimed you. You're led to a quiet space away from the hearth, away from the feasting grounds. A small enclosure near the chieftain's house, bordered by tall stones carved with protective runes. No one follows you, but you know you're being watched. Everything in this culture happens in layers. Visibility matters. But so does the suggestion of privacy enough to pretend you had a choice even if you didn't. In some Viking settlements, especially in early Icelandic and Swedish communities, there was a formal moment during the post-wedding days when the bride would be symbolically transferred from her natal kin group to her husband's lineage. This wasn't merely symbolic, it was legal. The woman's rights property, if any, and obligations shifted entirely. She moved from being under the authority of her father, or eldest brother, to being under the protection and control of her husband. One of the clearest historical sources confirming this is Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law code. It lays out procedures for marriage dowry and the bride's legal status. Notably, it specifies that a legal marriage must include the bride being led to the groom's home and into his bed in witness of at least 6 men to complete the transition of guardianship. This wasn't about intimacy. It was about public confirmation that the marriage, and therefore the transaction, was complete. You sit on a carved bench. It's old, deeply grooved from generations of use. Someone has placed a bowl of herbs nearby, likely meant to purify or bless. But the real ritual hasn't started yet. That will happen when he enters. When the man who now holds the right to call you wife steps through the curtain and takes your hand. Not gently, not cruelly, just firmly, as one would grip a tool or a prize. There's a tidbit recorded in an obscure 11th century Danish chronicle that describes how in some regions the bride would be tested, not in bed but by the household elders. Her demeanor, her silence, her readiness to serve. These early observations would determine her treatment in the months to follow. A bride who seemed too proud or too emotional might be deemed dangerous, less a blessing, more a liability. You hear footsteps now, measured, deliberate. He enters not with a smile, but with a nod. There's no intimacy here, just confirmation. You rise. He lifts your veil, touches your shoulder, and then gestures for you to sit again. You do. This is the moment when in some traditions a chieftain or elder might have stepped in. Particularly in powerful families, the bride was not given directly to the groom. She was introduced by a senior male relative, or in certain cases by the clan leader himself. The symbolism was clear. The bride did not pass directly from one man to another, but through the approval of the tribe's highest authority. And in rare but historically verified cases, that authority claimed first access. Let's pause there, because this is one of the most controversial, most unsettling aspects of Viking wedding customs, and one that historians still debate. There are references in sagas and legal texts that hint at a practice where a chieftain, priest, or elder might have the right to lie with the bride before the groom, sometimes framed as a blessing, sometimes as a claim of dominance. Known in some contexts as jus primae noctis, or rite of the first night, this practice has been widely documented in folklore but rarely proven in historical records. Most modern scholars agree there is no definitive archaeological or legal evidence that this was a common or accepted practice in Viking society. The references we do have tend to come from later Christian sources, often written with the intent to demonize pagan cultures. However, what can be confirmed is that symbolic substitutions, such as the bride being offered to the clan or the gods through ritual gestures, were far more common. And while these rituals did not involve physical acts, they served the same purpose: public proof that the bride was no longer her own. So no, your new husband doesn't touch you. Not in that way. Not yet. But what he does do is walk slowly around you, observing. He lifts the strands of beads from your neckline. He places a fur mantle over your shoulders. He offers you a drinking horn filled with spiced mead. You drink. This is all part of the ritual, part of the claiming. Outside, you hear the quiet murmur of the clan. They're not waiting for news of love. They're waiting for confirmation that the bride accepted the role, that the groom performed his duty, that the transfer was smooth, clean, without resistance. In this world, that's what matters. There's a strange story from Laxdela saga, one of the most detailed Icelandic narratives that describes a bride who refused to speak on her wedding day. For hours she remained silent even after the vows. Her new husband grew nervous, the clan whispered. The elder finally asked her directly if she accepted the union. She looked him in the eye and said, "I was taken, not asked." The saga doesn't end well for her. She's later exiled for bringing dishonor to the marriage. But that one sentence, preserved in a fading manuscript, still echoes. And now you find yourself wondering how many others thought it, but never said it. Because in a world where the bride's body belonged to the clan, her voice didn't matter much. Ownership was public. Identity was redefined. And consent that was assumed by the ceremony. Still you sit. Still you wear the mantle. Still you sip the mead. You know what's expected. But inside, something shifts. Not rebellion, not yet, just awareness. You are not just a vessel, you are a witness. And someday if someone asks you how this really felt, you will tell the truth, even if they call it myth. Outside the sky turns gold. The village begins preparing for the next round of rituals, but you for the first time since the wedding began are allowed to sit alone. You take a breath, and for that moment it is entirely your own. You don't remember falling asleep, but when you wake the world has quieted again, muted like snow even though no snow falls. Only the hush of dawn and the whisper of a breeze through the grass-thatched walls. Your breath catches. The weight of the fur cloak still hangs over your shoulders, though its warmth no longer comforts. You are alone, but you are not unobserved. Outside the ritual hut, preparations resume not for a ceremony this time, but for transition. You're no longer a bride. You're now a wife. And that shift in Viking culture wasn't symbolic. It came with responsibilities, expectations, and public scrutiny. Marriage wasn't a private contract. It was a declaration of function. And in many places, especially along the northern coasts, it began with a test. You step outside and are met by 3 women, the matriarchs of your new household. None of them smile. One carries a carved wooden box, another a long spindle. The third holds what looks like a ledger, though it's more likely a record of household goods, everything you now must manage. This is not a welcome. It's a briefing. In early Viking society, women were often granted a surprising level of domestic authority, at least on paper. Once married, a woman became the husfreyja, or lady of the household. She was responsible for overseeing servants, managing food storage, handling cloth production, and even safeguarding certain family heirlooms. She held the keys to the strongbox in the grain room. The literal keys, often worn visibly at her waist, were both practical and symbolic. They meant control. But don't mistake that for freedom. It was a narrow kind of power, bounded always by the needs and reputation of the clan. You were expected to obey your husband, care for his kin, and bear strong children. If you failed in those duties, the same rituals that once honored you could be turned against you. One historical fact often cited by scholars comes from the Icelandic Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, which records the lives and structures of early settler families. It confirms that Viking women could inherit land and even initiate divorce if the husband was abusive, infertile, or dishonorable. But those were rare rights, not widespread practices. And in many cases, a woman seeking divorce risked retaliation not just from her husband, but from his entire clan. There's a recorded tidbit from the 13th century Flatey Jarbok that tells of a wife who tried to leave her husband after he struck her. The saga says she ran to her birth family, who turned her away fearing retribution. She was sent back with an apology. She died within the year officially of fever, though the story implies otherwise. Her death was folded into the community's memory, not as a cautionary tale, but as a lesson in obedience. You watch now as the matriarchs unpack the box, folded linens, preserved herbs, dried fish, a ceremonial spindle carved with wolves and vines. They hand it to you wordlessly. You accept it with both hands. You are now the weaver not just of cloth, but of household fate. There's no applause, no toast, only the low hum of a new day beginning, and the quiet click of a key being added to the ring at your waist. And here's the part no one says aloud. This was the most dangerous moment for a Viking wife. Not the wedding night, not the feast, but the first few weeks after. The adjustment period, the time when the clan watches closely, measuring your obedience, your usefulness, your silence. Many women didn't make it through. In some regions, especially inland farming communities, there was a tradition known as the probing week. During this time, the wife was observed not just by her husband, but by his sisters, his mother, even his servants. She was expected to rise before dawn, prepare meals, recite ancestral lineages, and demonstrate fertility through ritual bathing and herbal offerings. If she failed in any of these duties, she could be sent back. But that return was not honored. It was shamed. A rejected bride rarely remarried. You kneel by the hearth, now arranging coals with a set of tongs. The room behind you is quiet. Your new husband is sleeping or pretending to. He hasn't spoken to you much since the feast. That too is expected. The early days of marriage were often marked by formality, even distance. Intimacy, if it came later. Or not at all. You hear footsteps outside. A child, maybe 8 or 9, peeking in through the doorframe. She holds a small basket of pine needles and salt. She doesn't speak, just offers it to you. A gift, or perhaps a test. You nod and take it. She watches a moment longer, then disappears. Historians still debate whether Viking marriages were truly partnerships, or more akin to contracts of convenience. Some argue that women, especially in Norway and Iceland, held genuine agency. Others believe the image of the free Norse woman has been romanticized, flattened by modern ideals. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. What's certain is this marriage was not just a joining of two people. It was the alignment of two families, two economies, two bloodlines. And the bride's success or failure often determined the peace or conflict that followed. There's a story from the saga of the Joms Vikings about a bride who managed her new household so well that her husband's father gave her a sword, an actual weapon, as a sign of respect. She never had to use it, but she wore it at her side for years, and it was said no one ever raised their voice in her presence. A rare story, but not impossible. And now, as you hang herbs over the doorway and sweep the ash from the hearth, you feel the weight of that possibility. You are not free, but you are not powerless either. That afternoon the elder returns. She brings a shallow bowl of clay and a single candle. She tells you in her gravelly voice that this is the final rite. You must light the candle and whisper your vows into the flame, not vows of love, but vows of duty, promises to the ancestors, the gods, the land. Not to your husband, to the role. You kneel again. You light the flame. You speak. I will rise before the sun. I will keep the bread unspoiled. I will carry blood with grace. And the candle burns steady. You are at last fully wed, fully owned, fully watched. But somewhere beneath the layers of duty and ritual, a question simmers. Who would you be if no one was watching? And you tuck that question quietly beneath your breath, like a thread in the hem of your tunic, a thought perhaps for another century. The air shifts now, not just in your lungs, but in the entire rhythm of the story. Because while Viking weddings may have been their own brutal theater, they weren't the only ones staged in such blood-soaked intimacy. Across the globe, in dynasties far from the icy fjords of the north, young women were being folded into marriages, with just as much ceremony and just as little say. If anything, some were forced to prepare long before they even understood what the word marriage meant. So let's leave the Norse longhouse behind just for a while. Let's cross continents to the east, where the Song and Ming dynasties in ancient China turned marriage into something more like contract law, except the terms were written in ink, sealed in blood, and applied to children. You're no longer wrapped in wolfskin and ash. Instead, you wear silk layers of it, though you're far too small to carry the weight gracefully. Your sleeves hang past your hands. Your feet have been bound not just in cloth, but in expectation. And though you are only 9 years old, the matchmaker arrives at your door. Yes, 9. Or 8. Sometimes even younger. In Imperial China, especially during the Song, 960, 1279 CE and Ming 1368, 1644 CE dynasties. Arranged marriages were considered foundational to a family's future prosperity. But it wasn't just about romantic union. It was about alliances. Families arranged matches years in advance, often between children to cement social or political ties. In elite households, a girl might be reserved by a groom's family as early as infancy, her name recorded on a formal contract known as a pinli. This practice wasn't limited to the upper classes. In many rural areas, poor families would betroth their daughters young to avoid the burden of raising them. Sometimes the girl would even be adopted into the groom's family and raised under their roof, a practice called tongyangshi, or child bride. The idea she would grow up knowing her role, loyal, compliant, pre-shaped into a wife. Historians confirm the tongyangshi system was widely practiced for centuries in both Han majority and minority ethnic regions of China. Though not officially outlawed until the mid-20th century, the tradition left deep marks on family structures and gender expectations, many of which lingered long after. And here's a disturbing tidbit from a 17th century village ledger. One rural family noted a betrothal between a 6-year-old girl and an infant boy, complete with a dowry of duck's grain and a bronze hairpin. The girl was sent to live with her future in-laws immediately. When asked about her parents, she reportedly said, "I don't remember them. I belong here now." You can imagine what followed. By the time the groom came of age, the bride had already been serving his family for years, cooking, cleaning, caring for younger siblings. Marriage wasn't a beginning. It was a graduation. Scholars still debate whether tongyangshi marriages were truly exploitative or whether they offered girls protection in uncertain times. Some argue the arrangement gave poor girls access to stable homes and upward mobility. Others point out that these brides often had no legal standing, and many were cast out or mistreated if the groom died or rejected the match. And what about love? That delicate thread, often irrelevant. You might be wondering, did any of these girls resist? Did they ever run? There's one recorded tale from the Qing dynasty of a 10-year-old tongyangshi bride who fled her assigned household and hid in a Buddhist nunnery. She lived there for several years before being discovered and dragged back to her husband's home. But by then he had already taken another wife. She was relegated to servant status. Her story is preserved in court documents, not as a tragedy, but as a breach of contract. Contract. That word again. In ancient China, marriage wasn't the beginning of intimacy. It was the culmination of paperwork, family deals, and often childhood obedience. And while the Vikings used violence to forge loyalty, the Chinese used documentation and routine. Both systems operated on the same premise: a bride's life did not belong to her. It belonged to the structure that absorbed her. And yet, let's not rush to judge one culture against another. They were all in their own ways reflecting what survival demanded of them. In a world where land inheritance and honor were fragile things, women became the thread that held the tapestry together, often unwillingly, often invisibly. But perhaps even then, some of them found small ways to bend the rules. A whispered poem, a late-night prayer, a secret refusal written in gestures too subtle for the elders to notice. Because even in silk and silence, rebellion finds a way. And so, wrapped in silk and silence, you drift east to west, only to find that royalty has its own strange rules, ones that defy even the faintest logic of childhood betrothal. Because if a girl in ancient China could be promised at 9, what would you say to a girl promised to her own brother, or a woman told that the only man worthy of her love was the man who already shared her blood? Now you find yourself in ancient Egypt, land of gold gods and incestuous dynasties. The air here smells of lotus and oil. The heat is dense, pressing against your skin like another layer of linen. And though your crown is heavy with lapis and turquoise, your smile is paper thin. Because tonight your groom is your sibling, and your wedding is not just a personal event. It is a divine reenactment. It's hard to explain just how common royal sibling marriage was in ancient Egypt, especially among the pharaohs. Cleopatra II married both her brother Ptolemy Thriphikos and later her other brother Ptolemy Thriphikos. The Ptolemies weren't even uniquely strange. This practice dated back over 1,000 years, tracing to beliefs about divine purity. Pharaohs were considered living gods descended from deities like Osiris and Isis. And since the gods had married their siblings in myth, so too should their earthly incarnations. To outsiders it may seem grotesque, but to the royal court it was symbolic perfection. Historians agree sibling marriage in the Egyptian royal line was deliberate, strategic, and deeply woven into the state religion. It consolidated power, kept bloodlines pure, and reduced the risk of rival claims. A shared bloodline meant shared divinity, and what was marriage, if not a divine union? But here's the haunting detail: these marriages weren't always ceremonial. Evidence from tomb inscriptions and surviving correspondence suggests that many of these relationships were consummated, producing children born of siblings. Some of these children became rulers in their own right. Others were deformed or died young, likely due to the genetic risks of incest. A tidbit that lingers in the mind: one sarcophagus from the 18th dynasty bears a rare inscription, mourning a beloved daughter born of divine siblings too beautiful for this world. The child died before age 5. The carving suggests both reverence and regret. Still, the rituals went on. On the wedding night, the couple would make offerings at the temple of Hathor, the goddess of love, joy, and fertility. They might bathe in sacred milk, anoint each other with perfumed oil, and eat ceremonial bread shaped like divine symbols. In some cases, small animals were sacrificed, their blood sprinkled on the doorway to sanctify the union. Scholars still argue whether this practice was widespread or symbolic, but the records are there, etched into limestone, whispered through history. And for the bride, the expectations were clear. She wasn't marrying for companionship. She was preserving the sun, God's legacy, embodying celestial continuity. Her body was the state's vessel, her womb a national treasure. You can imagine how little room there was for doubt. Interestingly, while sibling marriage was common in royal households, it was exceedingly rare among the general population. Most Egyptians married cousins, neighbors, or partners, chosen through local arrangements. The royal model was viewed with awe, but not imitation. And this is where things twist even further. Many modern depictions of Cleopatra VII, the famous one, erase or sanitize this history. Hollywood casts her as a seductress, a tragic queen in love with Roman generals. But in truth, she came from generations of sibling marriages, and may herself have been married to her brother at one point. If she wasn't the product of divine incest, she was certainly expected to perform it. Even love, when scripted by empire, has a way of becoming performance. And yet, under the heavy gold, past the ritual oaths beyond the stone temples, you wonder if some of these women found moments of humanity. Did they ever laugh with their brothers? Did they ever dread the wedding night as something more than a duty? We'll never know for certain. The papyrus records weren't written to preserve their feelings, just the laws. But one thing is clear: whether in a Viking longhouse or an Egyptian palace, the wedding night wasn't always a celebration. Sometimes it was a coronation, sometimes a sacrifice, and far too often it was a sentence signed in blood, whispered by gods, and sealed by silence. You're not in Egypt anymore. The gold fades, the perfumes dissolve, and the ornate silence of palatial incest is suddenly replaced by the scent of blood-soaked sand and the heat of tribal vengeance. Now you stand in ancient Persia, somewhere between the peaks of the Zagros Mountains and the desert plains of Elam. And this time the wedding isn't just a union, it's a treaty. A fragile piece of political theater inked in tears and sealed with someone's death. This is a Persian wedding of vengeance, and unlike the rituals of divine Egypt or the terrifying excesses of Viking Scandinavia, this one begins in the aftermath of violence. The bride's family has been wronged, a brother murdered, a son humiliated, a sacred well poisoned during a feud between two rival clans. And now the only way to restore balance, the only way to avoid generations of bloodshed, is for someone to marry into the enemy family. And not just anyone. You. Persian weddings, especially among noble or tribal households, were often used as political tools to settle scores and forge peace. A marriage could end a feud that had lasted decades, but peace had a price. Before the wedding could be considered valid, before the bride could be taken from her family, and the dowry exchange, the groom had to prove the sincerity of his remorse by killing one of his own. Let that sink in. To atone for your people's sins, you had to spill the blood of someone from your own side. A cousin, a kinsman, even a former comrade. Not in secret, but in full view of witnesses. Not in rage, but in cold ceremonial formality. The ritual had a name, kunabaha, or blood price. Sometimes it meant paying a literal ransom to the injured family. But in more extreme cases, particularly among warrior clans of the Achaemenid or Parthian eras, it meant human sacrifice in the name of justice. Not to the gods, but to the social fabric itself. A kind of societal atonement. Mainstream historians agree on the symbolic power of these rituals. According to writings preserved by Herodotus and later Islamic-era chroniclers, marriage and vengeance often walked hand in hand in the ancient Persian worldview. Where Western traditions might see love and forgiveness as opposites to violence, the Persians saw harmony in their overlap. Vengeance could be purified through union. Blood could be sanctified by marriage. But here's a tidbit that's harder to find in textbooks. In some regions of ancient Persia, the groom wasn't the only one required to make a sacrifice. The bride, too, had to offer something, often her hair, sometimes her voice. A bride might take a vow of silence on her wedding day, refusing to speak until her first child was born. It was a symbolic gesture of severing ties to her former life, her former family. In other cases, she would burn a cherished belonging, a doll, a necklace, a childhood garment to prove she had no intention of returning home. You don't hear that part in fairy tales. And if you're imagining this wedding night unfolding in a moonlit tent surrounded by camels and date palms, you're not far off. But you're also not prepared. Because unlike the feasting and song-filled nights of other ancient cultures, this night is quiet, almost reverent. You and your bride are watched not with joy, but with the solemn tension of diplomats. Your union is a political instrument, and every movement you make is a symbol. When you touch her hand, you are healing a wound between tribes. When you lie beside her, you're mending history itself. That's a heavy burden for a couple who've just met. Scholars still argue whether these weddings were consensual in the modern sense. In many cases, the bride was consulted, especially if she was of high rank. But in others, she had little choice. The pressure to preserve her clan's honor to prevent more bloodshed often overruled personal desire. One recorded case from the Sasanian period tells of a woman named Nahid, who begged her father not to marry her to a rival warlord. He refused. She was the last daughter of a long-dead lineage, and only her womb could restore the alliance. The marriage proceeded. Nahid bore 2 sons and died in childbirth. Her tomb inscription reads, "Peace was bought, not born." Let that line rest for a moment. Peace was bought, not born. There's something chilling in that sentiment, something that echoes through history far beyond Persia. And yet these weddings could and sometimes did lead to real reconciliation. Families who had once exchanged arrows now exchanged children. Clans that once traded insults now traded livestock. Over time, some of these unions became genuine partnerships. Affection bloomed from shared hardship. Love, oddly enough, sometimes followed vengeance. One fascinating account from the Median period describes a wedding that began as a hostage negotiation. The bride was taken from her family as insurance, a living symbol of peace. But within a year, she and her husband were so inseparable that their clans began to joke they had married their own grudge. The story was passed down as a parable that even wounds can learn to hold hands. Still, the scars remained. a fringe but real ritual recorded in regional epics and passed down through oral tradition, involved the burning of a bridge dress. Before her wedding, the bride would don a second ceremonial gown and walk across a makeshift wooden bridge over a shallow stream. As she stepped off the far side, her brothers or uncles would set the bridge aflame behind her. The symbolism was clear: no return, no retreat, no second thoughts. And while the imagery might strike you as cinematic, its emotional weight was immense. For many brides, this wasn't just a new life, it was the death of the old one. What makes these Persian wedding stories so resonant is that they echo so many of our modern fears. How much of ourselves must we sacrifice to find peace? How many compromises does it take to end conflict? And when we marry, do we always know what we're giving up? There's a quiet terror in realizing that some of our deepest romantic rituals, the vows, the family negotiations, the extravagant ceremonies, originated not from celebrations of love, but from the machinery of survival. Weddings weren't always about choosing someone. Sometimes they were about not dying. Even today, the echoes remain. You might hear them in a family argument about who gets invited to the wedding. You might feel them in the strange tension between tradition and personal will. You might notice it in the way couples still talk about relationships as compromise, sacrifice, or battle. Words that feel a little too sharp for something meant to be soft. But history rarely gives us clean edges. So here you are, married perhaps reluctantly, perhaps tenderly to a woman whose clan once counted you an enemy. There is no blood on your hands tonight, but the memory of blood lives in your footsteps. And as you walk through the firelight toward the tent that will become your bridal chamber, you begin to wonder what peace really means. Whether it's something you build or something you bury. And somewhere from the depths of memory, a voice whispers that line again: peace was bought, not born. And so you leave behind the golden halls of the Egyptian gods and slip silently westward across ocean and time, where obsidian blades catch firelight and plumes of incense swirl in the evening air. You arrive at the heart of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan, where weddings are not gentle affairs but fierce negotiations with the divine. The city itself feels alive beneath your feet. Built atop a lake, its stone causeways stretch like veins across shimmering water, carrying thousands of citizens in embroidered cloaks and feathered headdresses. The air is thick with the smell of maize chili and burning copal resin. Music pulses from temple steps, and warriors in jaguar pelts move with calculated pride. This is a place of cosmic balance where every act must please the gods, and marriage is no exception. In Aztec society, weddings were sacred transactions, not only between families but between mortals and deities. The union of two individuals was a reenactment of the original cosmic harmony, an attempt to echo the first coupling between the earth and the sky. And as with everything in this world, it came with rules, blood and fire. You now, in the skin of a noble daughter, feel the weight of this day in your bones. Your marriage has been arranged months in advance, blessed by the priesthood and calculated by calendar priests using the Tonopahwali, the sacred 260-day ritual calendar. Your future husband is a fellow noble, possibly a warrior, maybe a merchant. You haven't spoken. That isn't how things work here. The ceremony begins before dawn. You're cloaked in red, the color of fertility and fire. Your skin is scrubbed with scented oils. Your hair is oiled and arranged in twin loops adorned with feathers. A priest blesses you with burning copal tracing your body, with wafting smoke while whispering prayers to Xochiquetzal, the goddess of love, beauty, and women. But this isn't a wedding like the ones you've grown up watching in movies. There are no diamond rings, no vows in white chapels, no string quartets or walking down the aisle. Instead, you and your groom are bound together by your cloaks, literally tied at the corners of your garments as you kneel together before the family hearth. There, a ceremonial fire crackles, representing the sun and your role in keeping its warmth alive. As the crowd watches you both take turns casting dried maize into the flame, whispering wishes for prosperity, health, and fertility. Then the priest pricks your fingers. Both of you. The droplets of blood are smeared onto a strip of bark paper and cast into the flame. Unity here is sealed not by gold bands, but by pain. Shared blood becomes the first offering. This ritual is not some quaint regional tradition. It was widespread and central to Aztec marriage. The blood offering symbolized shared sacrifice, a willingness to serve one another and the gods. Scholars agree marriage in Aztec culture was a bond of service, not just to each other, but to the empire itself. The home was a microcosm of the state. A strong marriage meant stability, children, productivity, all things the gods demanded in return for keeping the world intact. What happens after the ritual may surprise you. There is no immediate feast, no wedding night filled with giddy expectation. Instead, you're led alone into a smoke-filled room. It's dark, thick with incense, and quiet as a tomb. Here you'll remain for 4 full days alone. No food, just water and prayers. This is your purification period. Your body must be cleansed of worldly desires. Your thoughts must become quiet. You're expected to emerge spiritually renewed, ready to serve your household, your husband, and your gods. The groom undergoes a similar isolation, though less stringent. After the 4th day, you reunite. Only then does the consummation occur, and only then do the real celebrations begin. Feasting, dancing, and offerings spill into the streets for days. Musicians play drums and flutes. Dancers wear hummingbird feathers and jaguar skins. You sit on woven mats beside your husband, accepting gifts of cacao, woven cloth, and polished jade. It is joyful, but never frivolous. A quirky detail to tuck into your memory in noble households. It was customary to give the couple a pair of live turkeys as part of the wedding gifts. Not just for eating, but for raising. Their fate symbolized the couple's ability to nurture life together. A turkey that thrived predicted a prosperous marriage. A turkey that sickened, well, you can guess. Yet beneath all this color and celebration, there's still a pulse of fear, because the gods are always watching. Take, for instance, the role of Tonacatecutli and Tonacachihuatl, the divine couple, considered the parents of humanity. It was believed they watched over all marriages, ensuring that each union upheld its sacred duties. A failed marriage wasn't just a private shame. It was a cosmic imbalance. In rare cases, marriages could be dissolved, but the reasons had to be serious infertility abuse, abandonment, and always judged by elders. So if your new husband turns out to be unkind, indifferent, or controlling, your options are limited. Divorce is possible, but socially costly. More often the wife must endure praying for change, hoping the gods soften his heart. A modern listener might bristle at this idea, but in the Aztec worldview, suffering had purpose. It built strength. It pleased the gods. One mainstream fact that still startles modern historians in some elite Aztec circles: it was considered good fortune if the wedding coincided with a thunderstorm. Rain, the gift of Tlaloc, god of fertility, was viewed as a direct blessing. There are recorded cases of couples delaying their wedding to increase the chance of an auspicious storm. And of course, as always, blood had its place, though not common at every wedding. Some noble families conducted additional sacrificial offerings after the ceremony, particularly if the couple held political or military importance. A slave might be ritually sacrificed. Their heart offered to the gods on the temple steps, their blood believed to strengthen the bond of the newlyweds. Yes, it's horrifying, but also deeply embedded in the culture's metaphysical worldview. To the Aztecs, sacrifice was not murder. It was renewal. The gods had bled to create the world. Human beings were simply repaying the favor. Historians still argue whether these post-wedding sacrifices were as widespread as early Spanish chroniclers claimed. Some scholars believe the conquistadors exaggerated them to justify their conquests. Others point to archaeological evidence, obsidian blades, altar stones and paintings on codices that confirm the rituals were very real, even if not as routine as Spanish priests insisted. And if you think all of this feels too dark to be about love, consider this: the Aztecs had an extraordinary poetic tradition, filled with metaphors about flower's breath and the fleeting beauty of existence. Many wedding blessings included lines like, "Life is a flower that opens at dawn May, your house bloom until the stars go out." That's not savagery, that's poetry. And somewhere inside this storm of ritual and fire, you might believe it. One final quirky note before we drift onward: Aztec brides sometimes carried a small pouch of amaranth seeds on their wedding day. Amaranth, the grain of the gods, symbolized endurance and sacred nourishment. Woven into the ceremony was a reminder that marriage was not about immediate joy. It was about sustenance, longevity, and service. You, bride of the Lake City, may not get a honeymoon. You may not get candlelight or whispered vows. But you get something your ancestors believed to be far more important: alignment with the cosmos, continuity with the past, and a place in the grand dance of life and death. And maybe as you sit beside your new husband, in the glow of a hearth fire, watching the turkey peck nervously at the mat, you even feel the first stirrings of connection. Not passion, perhaps, but possibility. And in this culture, possibility is sacred. You wake to the sound of distant bells. No, not wedding bells, but something far more ominous. The wind carries ash in the air, and the heat prickling your skin isn't just from the rising sun. It's from a pyre being built nearby. Not for warmth, not for light, and not for celebration, but for sacrifice. This isn't a wedding night for love or union. It's a test of a woman's loyalty and her willingness to die for the man fate has assigned her. This, dear listener, is the practice of Sati, the ritual self-immolation of a widow upon her husband's funeral pyre. And in some cases, it wasn't even optional. If you were a high-born woman in certain parts of India, especially during the late medieval and early modern periods, marriage came with a chilling footnote. In case of death, please bring firewood. Because a loyal wife wasn't just expected to serve in life, she was expected to follow in death. The logic was twisted and brutal. A wife's purpose was to remain tethered to her husband even in the afterlife. Her devotion wasn't measured in years of care or companionship. It was measured in whether she was willing to walk barefoot into the firelight beside her dead husband's body and be consumed by flame. And yes, historians have confirmed the practice. The term Sati comes from the Sanskrit for true woman or good wife. It wasn't simply metaphorical. The earliest documented references go as far back as the Gupta Empire in the 4th century CE, but the practice surged during the later Rajput kingdoms and under Mughal rule, by the time the British Raj rolled in during the 18th and 19th centuries. Colonial officials, despite their own problematic governance, recorded Sati with a kind of horrified fascination. Some years in Bengal alone saw hundreds of these fiery sacrifices reported. It wasn't isolated or rare. It was ritual. But let's pause here, not to excuse, but to understand. Because not every Sati was a blazing act of obedience. Some women were drugged, coerced, or forced physically onto the pyre. Others may have chosen it willingly, raised from girlhood, to believe that their value hinged entirely on dying pure, that a widow who lived on was a social stain, or worse, a cursed being. You can imagine what it does to a society when survival itself is seen as shameful. And here's where the tidbit comes in an odd, almost surreal side note in a sea of horror. Some communities actually offered the widow a kind of golden umbrella to shade her from the sun as she waited beside the pyre. The umbrella was symbolic, marking her as a divine figure about to transcend this world. It was a grotesque honor, like offering a crown to someone walking the plank. This image, sunlight glinting off parasol rib smoke in the background, is one of those odd collisions of ritual and cruelty that feels like something out of a fever dream. Of course, Sati was eventually outlawed. The British banned it in 1829 after a long public debate between colonial reformers, Indian intellectuals, and traditionalists. Reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who had seen his own sister-in-law perish on a pyre, fought passionately to end the practice. Yet the ban didn't erase Sati overnight. Cases continued to be reported into the 20th century and even into the 21st. In 1987, a young woman named Roop Kanwar was burned alive in Rajasthan under what was claimed to be a voluntary sati. She was just 18 years old. The public outcry that followed finally led to stricter laws, but the emotional ghosts of the practice still linger, and historians still argue whether the origin of sati was rooted in spiritual devotion or patriarchal control disguised as religious righteousness. Was it about the soul or about property? Because widows who survived their husbands often inherited wealth, land, and political influence. Convenient, then, that a society might find spiritual justification to erase her entirely. Dead wives don't inherit. They just burn. Imagine now, in the flickering firelight of that wedding pyre, how many romantic ideals we still carry that are warped echoes of practices like this. The notion that love must be proven through suffering, that loyalty is only real if it hurts, that a woman's role in marriage is absolute, unyielding, and ultimately expendable. Even today, how often do people frame jealousy as affection or emotional dependence as romance? The stories we tell ourselves, passed down through generations, often carry the smoke of old fires we no longer see. And now let's reflect on the brides of other worlds who didn't just wear white, they wore ash. While American weddings fuss over centerpieces and playlists, these ceremonies revolved around fire fate and finality. Can you imagine being a little girl playing with bangles? Being told that one day your wedding could end in flames, not metaphorically, not poetically, but physically. That the bond of marriage extended not to lifelong companionship, but to mutual destruction. Even among those who survived, who perhaps were widowed but escaped the fire, the scars remained. Widowhood came with its own social death. Forbidden to remarry, excluded from celebrations, dressed in plain clothes shorn of jewelry and status. A walking shadow in a world that prized brightness. This wasn't just about one ritual. It was about a worldview in which a woman's value vanished the moment her husband did. Of course, resistance emerged too. Over the centuries, poets, reformers, and brave widows themselves pushed back against this system. Women began founding ashrams, safe houses, where widows could live, work, and even educate the next generation. Reform movements grew louder, more confident, and slowly the notion that a good wife must die became controversial, then shameful, then criminal. Still, fragments of the belief system persist. In phrases like "till death do us part" in cultures that frown on widows who smile too soon or remarry too freely. In those who still whisper that a woman without a man is incomplete. These echoes remind us how deep the roots of marital martyrdom go, and how much pruning remains to be done. But now, breathe out. Step away from the firelight. Let the ashes settle, because as you walk through the haze of history, you begin to understand something crucial. Survival is not selfish. It is brave. It is radical. It is in some eras the greatest defiance a woman can offer. And if you've ever loved someone and thought I would die for them, maybe it's time we ask a better question. Would you live for them? Would you stay? Heal, grow old beside them in laughter, in silence, in safety. Because that, dear listener, might be the truest act of love of all. And now, as you exhale slowly into this dimming memory of fire and ritual smoke, your breath gently catches the wind and carries you far from the humid temples of the Aztec world, westward across the Pacific, through time and tide until the waves bring you softly ashore, to the hushed, disciplined elegance of Edo period Japan. The year could be 1702 or 1845, it hardly matters. You open your eyes and find yourself standing beneath the delicate bloom of a cherry blossom tree, its petals drifting down around you like 1,000 falling promises. The air smells of ink incense and quiet resolve. Welcome to a place where love isn't declared with kisses or candlelight, but with a cut across your palm and a signature penned in blood. You've arrived in the land of Ai no Chikai blood oaths of love. Here in the strict codes of Bushido love isn't some accidental whirlwind you stumble into. It is a contract, a duty, a binding promise made with such intensity that ink alone feels inadequate. And so in samurai households and private tea rooms tucked away from the world lovers, especially among the warrior class, would sometimes prick their fingers, write their names in blood, and seal their marriage agreements with a physical mark that could not be erased or rewritten. You can almost feel the sting of it now, sharp, fleeting, precise, like the love it represented. But don't confuse this ritual with melodrama. This wasn't romantic in the way modern films would have you believe. It was deadly serious. For a samurai, everything, absolutely everything, revolved around honor, loyalty, and the sanctity of one's word. The blood seal was not a poetic flourish. It was a declaration that breaking the vow meant inviting disgrace. And in this time and place, disgrace had only one remedy: death by one's own hand. The stakes were staggeringly high. Love here could not be undone. It could only be honored or ended. You feel the weight of this tradition in your chest, the way your breath slows and settles in your ribcage. The room where the ceremony would take place is simple, almost austere tatami mats beneath your knees, calligraphy scrolls on the wall, and perhaps a small dish to collect the drops of blood that would form your signature. No grand feast, no fluttering lace, no waiting guests checking their watches. Just you, your intended, and a truth inked in crimson. In one recorded case from the 1830s, a samurai named Akitada and his beloved, a woman from a merchant family, signed their wedding contract using a brush dipped in their own blood. The act was meant to bypass the objections of both families who disapproved of the match. For a time, the oath worked. Their union was respected, until Akitada's superior discovered the illicit bond. The punishment, seppuku, ritual suicide, and because she had entered the oath willingly, the woman followed him into death, though hers was not sanctioned by honor, but by sorrow. This wasn't an anomaly. It was a consequence understood from the beginning. A blood promise was beautiful only because it was irreversible. Mainstream historical records from Edo period marriage documents rarely mention blood oaths. They were not exactly legal, nor widely accepted, but their presence lingers in folklore private diaries, and even in early kabuki dramas where characters cloaked in shadow quietly cut their fingers to sign scrolls beneath moonlit trees. Historians still debate whether such rituals were common or rare. Were they the romantic outliers of the age, or a widespread undercurrent beneath a rigid social order? The truth, as always, may rest somewhere in the middle. But one thing is certain: in Edo, Japan, marriage was not just a union between individuals. It was a bridge between families, political alliances, even between social classes. And so when the oaths were broken, or merely suspected of being broken, the consequences reached far beyond the couple. Honor was contagious here. So was shame. If your spouse dishonored you, you weren't just wounded, you were erased. Samurai wives who committed adultery could be ordered to perform jigai, a female version of ritual suicide involving the slicing of major arteries in the thighs or neck. Not because they were criminals, but because the shame of betrayal was considered socially toxic. Silence was the desired sound of regret. And yet, despite the brutality, the aesthetic of love remained breathtakingly beautiful. The calligraphy was flawless. The gardens were trimmed to perfection. The poetry exchanged between lovers, whether hopeful or grieving, was exquisite. You could walk through a moonlit garden filled with night-blooming jasmine, reading verse after verse of longing loss and unspeakable devotion, and never guess that some of the authors wrote their final lines moments before death. That's what's most chilling and oddly tender about this culture of love and death. It wasn't sensationalized. There were no loud declarations or theatrical weeping. Everything was quiet, reverent. Even suicide was orchestrated with precision and care. The futon was laid out, the blade cleaned, witnesses were chosen, the final poem written with trembling brush. Death was not seen as tragic. If it honored the code, it was seen as appropriate, even beautiful. This brings us to a quirky but real tidbit. During the 18th century, some samurai women carried ceremonial dagger sets called kaiken in their obi belts, not for defense but specifically to be used if dishonor ever befell them. These weren't everyday weapons. They were more like portable exit strategies. Imagine going to a wedding today and tucking a tasteful suicide blade into your purse, just in case. It sounds unthinkable, but here it was tradition. And still, not all blood oaths ended in tragedy. Some were honored for decades, written down once, and then quietly followed for a lifetime. One preserved marriage scroll from 1821, now kept in a Kyoto museum, contains the names of a couple who pledged fidelity using blood ink, and who went on to raise 5 children, pass on their scroll like a family heirloom, and die of natural causes in their 80s. The parchment is yellowed now, the blood faded to rust-colored specks, but the oath remains visible. Their love, it seems, survived not just death, but history. You lean into that idea for a moment, that perhaps beneath all the harsh codes and ceremonial punishments, there was something real, something deeply human trying to bloom through the cracks. Maybe it was just shaped by a different soil. After all, what would any of us do if we were told that love had to be proven with blood? Would we dare to sign as the breeze stirs the petals around you? You think of the words not spoken aloud in this culture. I love you, I'm scared. Please stay. These weren't part of the performance. But maybe they echoed anyway in the shuffle of robes, the tightening of a sash, the way 2 hands brushed as they exchanged a scroll. Because even in the most brutal systems, love finds a way to sneak in, quietly, barefoot, carrying a brush. And maybe those blood oaths weren't about violence at all. Maybe they were desperate attempts to say, this matters, you matter, I want this to last. Even if they went about it in a way that now seems terrifying. You step away from the cherry blossoms, your feet crunching gently on the gravel path. The garden is silent, but your heart carries the weight of everything you've just seen and felt. The ink has dried, the blood has faded, but the oath remains. There's something fragile in the silence that follows centuries of noise, after generations spent screaming for power, for blood, for meaning. You feel it now, don't you? That delicate hush where the echoes of ritual chants, battle cries and wedding bells soaked in fear begin to dim. But unlike the Viking bride with blood on her veil, unlike the samurai wife who inked her vows in crimson, you're still here, still breathing, still allowed the luxury of choice. And that's where we begin. Not with a sword, not with a ritual, but with a quiet awareness. You don't have to keep repeating what hurt them. Not the grief buried in old altars. Not the cycles of pain sewn into ceremonies. Not the generational inheritance that demands love must look like conquest. No, now you can choose differently. You might think breaking those ancient patterns requires grand gestures, some dramatic vow against the past. But it's actually much quieter than that. It starts with something as small as asking, where did this idea come from? The one that says relationships must hurt to be real, or that suffering is somehow noble when it comes to love. That jealousy proves devotion, that dominance equals protection. Most of us never question these ideas because they're so deeply rooted in stories we've been told for centuries. But when you trace them back gently, patiently, you'll often find a wedding torch somewhere at the origin, a night soaked in fear, a ritual cloaked as celebration. You might remember from earlier that in many cultures weddings were structured more like initiation ceremonies than celebrations. That's no accident. The idea was to transform people through pain, through spectacle, through submission, and those who refused, they were deemed incomplete, undevoted, unworthy of love. That framework didn't just disappear. It was softened, repackaged, and passed down. Today it's the pressure to have the perfect wedding, the subtle belief that your partner should fight for you, or that love is only proven under duress. You might hear it in songs, in wedding toasts, in old proverbs whispered by well-meaning relatives, but it all carries the same shadow. Here's something most people don't realize. Healing from those patterns doesn't mean discarding tradition altogether. It means understanding where those traditions come from, and gently choosing the ones that nourish, rather than wound. Consider this the modern idea of exchanging rings as a symbol of unity. Its origins go back to ancient Egypt, where circles represented eternity. That's beautiful, right? But over time, in some European cultures, that ring became a mark of ownership. The hand was no longer simply held, it was claimed. So maybe you still choose the ring, but you redefine it. You wear it not as a chain, but as a promise to yourself and your partner to love without conquest, to protect without control, to grow without demanding submission. This is how healing looks. Not loud, not dramatic, just intentional, soft. Now let's talk about what happens when we don't break the pattern. According to the National Institutes of Mental Health, unresolved generational trauma can affect not just your emotions, but your immune system, your stress response, even your parenting instincts. Children raised in households where love and violence are intertwined, where emotional withdrawal is punishment, or where affection is earned through obedience, grow up with a nervous system shaped by fear. And even if they swear they'll never repeat those mistakes, they often do. Not because they want to, but because those neural pathways were carved early and deeply. But the good news, the truly quietly revolutionary good news, is that those pathways can be rewritten, slowly, with care, and with practice. In Denmark, a study on intergenerational trauma revealed that children of Holocaust survivors showed significantly higher rates of anxiety, but that rates dropped sharply in families that actively discussed their history, acknowledged the pain, and created new traditions. That's the key, new traditions. Not erasing the past, but integrating it, making something new. So what might that look like in your life? Maybe it's choosing to celebrate anniversaries with handwritten letters instead of grand spectacles. Maybe it's sitting down with your children and telling them stories of love that aren't rooted in sacrifice or control, but in listening patience and shared laughter. Maybe it's gently declining to participate in family traditions that feel performative or toxic. Maybe it's therapy. Maybe it's journaling. Maybe it's just quiet time together without demands. One quirky tidbit from the 19th century in parts of rural Scotland. Couples used to mark their engagement, not with a feast, but by planting a tree together. If the tree grew strong, they believed so would the relationship. And if it didn't, well, that told them something too. A soft green ritual. No fire, no blood, just growth. You can plant that kind of ritual in your own life too. Historians still debate which cultures had the most harmonious views of marriage. Some point to the Minoans, others to certain pre-colonial African societies. But what matters more than academic consensus is your lived experience. You are not a reenactor. You don't owe the past your pain. You don't need to cosplay through suffering to honor your ancestors. They made choices based on their world. You get to make choices based on yours. This is where that gentle power lies, in your ability to stop the reenactment, to see where your anxiety in relationships might come, not from your partner, but from inherited survival scripts. That twitch of defensiveness when you're vulnerable. It might be 1,000 years old. That moment you pull away when someone gets too close. That might not be you, it might be a Viking echo, whispering that closeness is dangerous. But here's the twist the sagas never offered you. Get to rewrite the ending, not with a sword, but with softness. You may never completely erase the imprints of ancestral pain, but you can soften them. Every moment you choose gentleness over punishment, connection over conquest, is a small rebellion against millennia of brutality. And that's powerful. Think of yourself now not as a warrior in armor, but as a weaver, gathering threads from the past, some golden, some blood-stained, and deciding what kind of tapestry you'll make. You don't need to burn the old stories. Just stop letting them dictate your own. There's something beautifully defiant in that. In turning pain into patience. In crafting love that doesn't require trophies or trials. In resting while your ancestors stood tense. In laughing while they braced for blows. And when you look back at Viking longhouses, Egyptian palaces, Aztec temples, you might feel a strange mix of sorrow and awe. They did what they knew, and now so do you. You know that love doesn't have to hurt. You know that rituals can evolve. You know that stories can change. And more importantly, you know that you can be the one to start that change. So tonight, as you lie in bed with centuries behind you, know this, you've already begun. By listening, by wondering, by questioning, you've stepped off the path that once led to torches and tears. You've taken the quieter road, the one lined not with blood, but with blooming things. And that, dear listener, is how the cycle breaks. So now your breath slows, gently, evenly, like waves settling after a long storm-tossed tide. You've walked through firelit halls and blood-sealed promises, through wedding nights cloaked in fear and centuries tangled in ritual. But tonight you are not a bride to be taken. You are not a groom to prove yourself. You are simply safe. Whatever the stories have told you about love or worth or what must be endured, know that they were written in a time that no longer owns you. You are not bound by those old scripts. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to let go. There is no torch chasing you here, no crowd watching, no vow written in blood, just the steady rhythm of your own breathing, in and out, like a lullaby older than any empire. If you carry wounds shaped by stories older than your lifetime, you're not alone. And you are not broken. You are simply the place where something painful has paused, and something kinder is beginning. You don't have to fight, you don't have to prove. You only have to be. And in this quiet moment, with your heart still and your thoughts growing softer, you've already begun to undo what centuries once called fate. So sleep now, not like a warrior, but like a gardener, hands open, spirit calm, letting what no longer serves you fall gently away. There will be more stories tomorrow, but for tonight, just this peace. You've come so far, you've broken the cycle, and you're safe now. End of script. Sweet dreams.